So, hi everyone. I'm glad you came or are watching this on YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about accessibility on the web, which I personally think is really important and sometimes less appreciated. So I have the notes open here. I'm not really going to read them word for word, but yeah, it's on GitHub.
Wait, Karen, tell us about who you are.
Oh, hi.
How do you know us? Well, what previous web design experience do you have?
I know Matt. He's cool. And I met Leo today. He's cool. And I work for web design or like user experience at the STAN program at UCLA, and which is something you probably haven't heard of, but it's cool. And I work with a team of people who do web development. So we just make websites, kind of like apps, things like that. So that's my experience. And yeah.
Is it also true that you were so good at design that UCLA Reslife broke their hiring policy and hired you without interviewing you?
Mad stop. This is technically true, and then they laid me off because of the pandemic, so that's also technically true. Yeah. So, okay, so let's go into why accessibility is important. Some of the people I've worked with in the past, even people who have degrees in computer science, they don't think about accessibility. And not that this is like their fault or something, but that's why I think this is really important. And first of all, we have to think about supporting a wide variety of web users. And so this can be wider than most people think about when they think of, oh, like maybe people with disabilities are maybe just a minority of users and we don't have to worry about it most of the time. But actually, this accessibility covers a very wide range of people, right? I think of statistics in here, maybe let me find it, 1 out of 8 men experience colorblindness, but maybe I'll find it later. But there's a lot of people in conclusion that experience things such as using a screen reader, which we'll cover later, and people with visual impairments, and people with susceptibility to seizures. And so there's actually a lot of people we need to think about for, are we reaching the widest audience that we can with our websites? Another thing is that a side effect of having good accessibility is that it actually improves the experience for everyone. We'll go over that a little bit more later. And if you aren't the sort of altruistic type, there is an economic motivation, which is that if you please a lot of people, then you get more user satisfaction and traffic to your website will increase, hopefully. So those are the motivations for having good accessibility.
One other thing I'll just quickly slide in as supposedly a diehard capitalist is that if you follow a lot of these things, search engines like Google will actually rate your site higher. So following these kinds of things, even if you are the most cold-hearted person in the world, makes it so that when people look for your website online, they'll see it first. So another thing to keep in mind, obviously we all care about people, but back of your mind.
This is a good point from the cold-hearted capitalist. Yeah, so let's go into what accessibility is. So this is an extremely bad website I made that breaks all the rules of accessibility, and we're just going to, most of the time through this workshop, use this as a kind of launching point to talk about the different aspects of accessibility. Let me see if I missed anything. Okay, so let's imagine that we are all part of a team of people that this company, Music Box, has hired to take a look at their website and see what could be improved or what could help them get, better SEO ratings or better, traffic and stuff. And so as we're looking at this website, you don't have to know anything about accessibility to see that, if they asked you, what would you personally change about this website? There's things that might be ugly or weird to you that you might want to change. And you can just shout it out or put it in the chat box. What's something that someone wants to change about this? I'm going to make you participate.
The words are really hard to read.
In what way?
I guess they're really bright on a bright background, I think.
That is a very good point. This brings me to the topic of color contrast. So I'm going to go over here and show you all a resource that I use very often, so you don't have to try to see, oh, is this contrasting enough so that people can read it? There's actually something called a contrast ratio. This is the WebAIM contrast checker. And so you can put in, let's say, the color on my website is this, and I want to use it against a background of white. And this contrast ratio is calculated by taking kind of the luminance, or like, in other words, brightness of the two colors and comparing them to each other. And if they're not different enough, then you fail. And it will tell you that in general standards, it's not good for people to read, right? So this obviously wouldn't pass standards. It's very light, very hard to read. And we're just gonna go in here and change that. Maybe black will be easier to read. Oh, whoops. Does everyone agree that's slightly better? And I can fix that later. Or I won't fix it now because it'll be too hard. But anyways, any other things that we can change to make it easier to read, easier to process?
Well, I, for one, oh, sorry, Danielle, excuse me, don't let me interrupt.
You're good. No, I was just thinking, oh, Karen, that font. I don't know if I can read it very well. Uh-oh.
Exactly, Danielle. You have a very good point here. This brings up using body fonts versus display fonts. So what does that mean? Well, display fonts are kind of like the fancy things that you might use for logos or titles, you know, but when someone's reading a large block of text like right here, it can be kind of hard to scan that very easily. There's this thing in typography called serifs. I don't know if you all have heard of that. It's like the little hooks on the ends of letters that, here I'll show you. The little hooks on the ends of the T's and on the H's. So that's a serif font. And if you don't have those hooks, this is a sans serif font. And so these are normally the two types of fonts that people expect when they visit a website. They expect to have this easily readable font, whereas this kind of unexpected, harder to read. So let's change that too. Let's choose Roboto. That's a pretty good sans serif that I already have loaded. And that'll be a little bit easier to read. And something that I actually haven't put in the notes yet is increasing the line height, or the space between these words, can make it easier to read as well. Using space in your designs is something that I think Timothy mentioned in one of the other lessons. Let's say, I think that increased a little bit, which then makes it a little bit easier to read. And now we fix those two. All right, anything else? And if no one can come up with anything, then I'll just...
Karen, I don't know about you, but I have a pretty small attention span, and it's kind of hard for me to focus on things. And there's a lot of flashing animations on the screen. And I can't help but think that for other people, that'd be a big problem too.
Yes, Matt, you are completely right. So let's look at, first of all, this animation, which is made using CSS animations, another great thing we learned in one of Leo and Matt's great workshops. CSS animations. And it turns out that the W3 guidelines for animations is less than 3 flashes per second, because anything more than that can be triggering to people who are susceptible to seizures. And it can also just be distracting to you know, your typical user who's scrolling around and it's like, oh man, there's like that flashing thing, it's so annoying. So there's a few ways we can overcome this. This right here is a GIF, and I've heard of plugins or something that, or maybe some code that people have developed that you can put a GIF there and users can pause it just like you would a video. And I don't have good knowledge on that, but I can link a resource later. Another way is that for CSS animations, we can just simply, what is it? Make the animation last longer. So it's not flashing as many times, but it still might have that cool effect you're looking for. Like that. And let's see, and just limiting the number of GIFs that you use. Maybe you don't really need this, or maybe you can make it flash less times per second. Things to think about in terms of animations. So usually we'll try to limit the number of animations that we have on any given page, even if the CSS animations are super cool and you want to use them and it's like, oh, this will make me look really great as a web designer. But you also have to think about how people are using this and whether they would enjoy using this. And as a last point on animations, this video is set on loop and autoplay. And it's great that there are these controls here, so someone who doesn't like this can stop it. But I was personally very happy when YouTube stopped autoplaying its videos when you open a video in a new tab, because people might not want to watch your video as soon as they get to as soon as they open your page. So it's good to not have autoplay. And I'll go over here. And some of this code might not have been covered in this course yet, and that's okay if you don't know exactly what it does. What's important is that we gain familiarity with the things that can cause problems. And you can always Google how to fix these things later, but we need to be aware of these problems. Any questions so far? No? Okay, great. We shall continue. And I'm going to check if there's anything that I've skipped here. I think just zoom levels. So we're nearing the end of the things that we can visibly, like directly identify here that are problems. And so one of the ways, or one of the other visible things that can happen is in standard guidelines, you should make sure that any website you're making, if you zoom into 200% or less, then everything should still be readable and usable. Sometimes if you're not using Flexbox, which we also covered earlier, if you're using things like position absolute or other fixed positioning, then things can get a little messy when you zoom in. Let me zoom in like super far. I guess this is the farthest you can go. You can see that this starts to cover half of the page, and that can be a problem for some websites. So just be aware of that. And I think that's it. The things are just visually very apparent. So the next topic we're going to go into is screen readers. So screen readers are either apps or I think sometimes Chrome, I think, has a built-in screen reader. So what the purpose of these are is for people who have visual impairments and other people, they will use screen readers to literally read out the content of the page because they aren't able to, you know, just view it like it is, like here. So the interesting thing is that screen readers ignore CSS and JavaScript. So all this pretty packaging that you see here isn't visible to a screen reader, and that comes with some consequences. And this is actually a really big part of accessibility, so it's a really important topic. Let's go into semantic HTML. In the earlier HTML workshops, we used some divs, and divs are great. They're good for like containers where you can kind of corral a group of stuff together and then easily go to the CSS and style that group of stuff by using IDs and classes. But there's actually special tags that we can use instead of div. So I'm going to replace this with nav. This is one of the special semantic HTML tags. And what that means is that there's a group of tags that are specifically used for organizing a page, for common elements that you see across a lot of websites. Like most websites will have some kind of nav bar up here and a footer, and like maybe you run like a recipe website or a blog, and like so each individual page will have like what's called an article or things like that. So there's a lot of these tags for these specific purposes, and they have to do with screen readers because screen readers will, first of all, use headers, are very important for screen readers. They will take out the headers and put them into a table of contents. So if you can't preview a page by scanning through it visually, then you can preview it by saying, oh, this heading looks important, then I'll go here. And sorry, headings, not headers. And second of all, when a screen reader is reading a page, if you don't have individual headings that are formatted correctly, then it'll just read the whole thing in one go. And what screen readers usually do is they pause before each heading. So in order to give you time to kind of process the information as it's reading. So there are different reasons to use semantic HTML correctly. And so let's take an example here. This contact us, one of the really big problems that people run across when they're designing for the web is they will mistakenly use heading tags for formatting. So that's what CSS is for. We shouldn't be using headings to make this text larger. We should be using CSS to make it larger. So in order to fix that, we can just put this in a P and then style it later. I'm not going to do it now because it kind of takes a lot of time or some time. But similarly, this link should just be wrapped in here. Any questions about semantic HTML so far? Great. Yeah, and there's a footer tag too. Great. And when I refresh the page, make note that nothing should have changed. It's because I didn't update the CSS. Here. Okay, nothing changes from before. And that's really important because it's hard for you to visually spot by yourself, oh, I forgot to use semantic HTML. So you have to be sure that you're, okay, that didn't work, but that's probably more CSS. Anyways, you should be thinking about semantic HTML as you're building your HTML for the first time, so you don't have to go back and like switch out, oh, nav is a tag I can use and things like that. All right. Our next topic is going to be Tabindex. So actually you can use the tab button to navigate the links on a page. I think it'll be easier. See, just jumping around on the different links on my page. Probably easier if we go here. Yeah, so people who use screen readers and people who use the tab key to navigate a page, they'll only see the links, especially those who use screen readers. They won't see the context around the link. So what's important about that is we can make sure to label links instead of, this used to be something that said here. Instead of here, we should say create account, or like we should link the whole thing, get in touch here. So it's more clear what that link is referring to. Sorry, jumping around a bit. And I think we should go into alt text next. I'm going to try to disable images. I'm going to break all the source links. Quick. Sorry, it's going to take 1 second. Oh no. Oh. Why? Fine, so
Maybe
that's not
because
working.
it's open in your web browser.
Possibly. Possibly. But it should be static, right? Let's try one more time, and if it doesn't work, then I'll just not care. Thanks, Matt. You're great. Okay, let's open that once more. Nice. So now you can see that all of our images are completely broken. And you can see why we need alt text. So say for some reason my browser is super slow or I just don't like images. And I open this website and the alt text says this. This is pretty useless. And so what I want to emphasize here is that writing alt text does take a little bit of thought. It's not just putting whatever in there. And especially I've worked with people who say, I just ignore alt text because it's annoying and I don't know what it does. What it does is that for people who, the image doesn't show up for some reason, for people who are using screen readers, they can kind of see what they're missing out on with the alt text. So what are ways we can improve the alt text? There's 3 kind of rules that I made up. The first one is to accurately and fully describe what's in the image. So you shouldn't say anything that's not in there, which seems obvious, but there shouldn't be anything like, oh, this is what it means. Or, I mean, let's take an example of the logo. You shouldn't say, this logo represents the musicality of a company. It can be pretty simple. The second rule is be as brief as possible. Logo, that's all you really need. And let me go back. The third rule is, does the image actually add context? So for the background image, we don't really need alt text because it was purely decorative, bunch of like circles and stuff. And so that you wouldn't really be missing out on anything if you couldn't see that image. So that's why we don't need alt text. And let me open up the CSS file too. What's interesting is that you can't add alt text to images that are put on the website through CSS. That's not a function that CSS has. So make sure when you're doing background images that you're not putting anything in the background that has context that is really important to understanding or using your website. So those are the 3 rules. Be brief, describe it enough, and figure out if you actually need alt text. However, if you don't need alt text, then you can't just not use the alt attribute because screen readers will then often read out the entire file name, which is kind of annoying. So always make sure to, if you don't need alt text, here, then we just put empty quotes like that. This is an instance where we should have alt text, but anyways, so I'll just leave it like that. And also a transcript. So if you see this video here, I guess if it did work and we had something like an interview or informative videos talking about what Music Box is, its history or something like that, then we should really also be including a transcript with it. The standard file type for transcripts is WebVTT, which has been included in the lesson with Tomoki about web design. But anyways, so that's just, if you're curious, you can go there and see what a WebTT file is like. But we include them with a track tag. And track tags look like this. In HTML5, you're going to nest them inside the video tag. And there's different attributes here that help with including subtitles, like kind, which we specify as subtitles as opposed to closed captions or something. The source language, which is going to be a 2-letter language code that you can just Google, or if you're doing languages other than English, but for English, the code is EN. And then the label is for when you're selecting a certain language, say, as the user, you're going to be selecting something from a menu. Oh, do I want English? Do I want Spanish subtitles? That's what that's for. And so these are important not only for people who are hard of hearing and kind of would prefer having subtitles so they can understand what's going on in the video, but also for people who are like in a busy airport or a train station, or their audio isn't working for some reason, and people can still enjoy your video even if they can't hear it very well. Did I talk about autoplay yet? I think I did.
Yeah, you did.
I did not?
Oh, no, you did. Sorry.
Oh, I did. Okay, sounds good. Any questions so far about alt text, transcripts? Okay. I think that we don't have very much to cover left. I think it's only reading level. Yeah.
I have a question, Karen.
Yes, Matt.
See, I'm not very good with web development. So, maybe sometimes I'll like forget this stuff, or I might miss something. Are there any tools that I could use to make it easier for me to remember to do these kinds of things? Or I don't know, like audit a website. Could I do that?
Wow, what a specific question that has a good answer. So at the end of these notes, I've linked some things that you can use to kind of, like Matt said, audit your website. Sometimes you might forget things even if you have the best intentions. So this is a browser extension for Chrome, and I think they probably also have one for other web browsers like Firefox. And these are all just different tools you can use to, and there's a lot more out there to check for you if you're maybe following contrast, if you're following subtitles and autoplay and all those things that we talked about, if you're following the guidelines for them. And obviously you should never only rely on one of these audit checker thingies as your measure of, oh, is my website accessible enough? I think they're good for reminding you what you should be doing, but ultimately, I think it also takes common sense to feel like, oh, is this website usable? Is it going to be enjoyable for a very wide range of users? And for another thing, accessibility standards are just like the rest of web design, changing all the time. So you have to, or we have to, make sure to keep reading on it and keep changing our practices to best serve people. So yeah. Going back to the last little topic in the main content, which is reading level. And this doesn't specifically have to do with coding, but I wanted to include it because it's still really important. the standard for general audience websites is to have content at an 8th grade reading level. And that's seems kind of arbitrary and confusing because who knows what an 8th grade reading level really is. I think the basic thought behind that is you should assume that your audience has a, base level of intelligence. We're not going to talk to them like they're 5-year-olds, but we also can't assume that everyone, has a high school or college degree, or everyone has English as their first language. There's English language learners and people with reading disabilities and people who don't have a high school degree, and all of those kinds of people who it can be alienating to use really a lot of jargon and really annoyingly complicated language. And also it can help to cut down on the number of words you use. There's simpler phrases you can use, and then that'll make everyone happy because you don't have to read 1,000 words when you're visiting a website. So this is important because even if you're not responsible for writing the content on a website, which few of us probably will ever be, web designers are still often asked for feedback. And so it's important to be aware of this and to bring awareness of the 8th grade reading level to other people who might not think about that. And obviously this can change depending on the audience of your website. Maybe you're writing for a university website and that's going to be different. But yeah, that's all for reading level. Let's see, anything else down here?
Aaron, I have a question for you.
Yes, Leah.
So you obviously have a lot of experience in this area, and you're that's applauding, and you have a very strong background in all of this, right? And in all of your time as a UX designer, what would you say is probably one of the biggest additions or modifications that you've seen to web accessibility?
What do you mean by modification to web accessibility?
Well, I just mean in the sense you mentioned that that's always changing, right, as a standard,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what would you say is one of the biggest things you've seen change in the standard and your time as a UX designer?
Wow, that's a good question. I have not been a UX designer for that long. I think I started this maybe 1 or 2 years ago. So, but I will tell you that I learned even researching for this workshop, there's been things that have changed since I first started. And this is a very little thing. For example, in this example, I used the at role called at media or whatever media. And so this is used as a breakpoint. If any of you aren't already familiar, this is kind of used as an if statement. Like if my screen is less wide than 768 pixels, which is usually the size of smartphones, then I'm gonna do a different font size than if the screen is larger than that. And this is one thing that's changed. It used to be media screen and, which is used for computer screens, but now it's media all and, so we can account for things with different screens, like, I don't know, tablets, Kindles, I don't really know. But yeah, and it's changed in very small ways in like 1 or 2 years, but it's definitely still changed. And yeah, just like everything else in web design. That brings me to the points that I didn't actually cover these things, so let me cover that real fast. Let's see. I should really fix this back so you can see with images what's going on. But in the original, I'm just gonna do this. I'm just gonna go back. In the original website, some of the text was actually at too small a font to be considered readable to the average user. And there's standards that are commonly used across the web. And for desktop, we usually do around 18 pixels. And for mobile, we do around 16 pixels, and those are the standards. But there's an example here that shows that for some fonts, it can actually look slightly different at the same font size. So this lucid or bright example kind of looks bigger than the Calibri, even though they're technically both 16 pixels. So, you know, these aren't hard and fast rules. You can adjust them as you need, but kind of a minimum of 16 pixels is expected for a website. There we go. So this one's kind of small, and we would want that to be a little bigger for people to be able to easily scan and read text. And I think that's it for that. Other questions from people you can submit in the chat. Anything that you might have heard of that I didn't cover, anything you're confused about.
If no one else is going to take up on that offer, I will. So you mentioned that 16 pixels and 14 pixels are, or 16 and 18, sorry, I'm just kind of throwing out numbers. No, 16 pixels, right, is kind of the standard, right?
Right.
And the standard varies based on viewport or device type, yeah?
Right.
So how does this play into units such as emits, right? Like REM or EM, right? Does that change based on the device that you're on, or is it constant?
Oh, I actually would not say I'm super confident on this topic. From what I know, you set the kind of base unit of REM or EM in HTML is like 16 pixels, and then REM and EM is like a unit based off of that. But if either Matt or Leo wants to talk a little bit more about that, that'd be cool.
Yeah, that's 100% right. Karen, killing the game. Amazing guest lecture. Just one quick thing is if you don't set, so normally it's good practice to set the font size for the HTML tag. And I think we talked about this very briefly in like our very first lesson, but you know, Maya has like, I can feel it's been a long day. A lot of stuff has been going on. So if you don't set it, then it goes back to the browser default. And this actually is different between browsers. So Chrome, Firefox, and Safari have all agreed to use the same default, but frickin' Internet Explorer has not. So not to say that Internet Explorer is a bad browser, even though it is, it's good for you to set it anyways. So then when you use REM and EM and all these other kinds of things, it's very easy for you to know what the units are. Because if you don't, you might go to Internet Explorer and your page looks super small, and then you're angry at Bill Gates and it's all his fault.
So in context of that, would you say it's better? I've heard some people set it at like 100% in order to conform to the web browser.
Oh yeah, that's a different problem. So that's if you want to use position relative and absolute in reference to the entire screen. So this has to do with like sticky footers. Like if your page, for example, Amazon sent me this like 40-inch monitor. This monitor is really big. And it's painfully obvious now that some people haven't actually done this, because then like their web page gets cut off. Like it's too small, and there's just a bunch of like random stuff after that, and that's not what you want to see. That's usually why you do that. If you don't remember what position relative and absolute means, you can watch my very boring lecture on the box model and positioning, and you can get a quick reminder. But this is also good for like Flexbox and all that kind of stuff too. But then for font size in particular, I just put a number, because 100% is going to inherit it off of the root pseudo selector, which is something we didn't talk about. But that is still browser variable. So that in and of itself is like no point out. Browsers suck. Do your own standardization.
Okay, so in conclusion, in order to produce the most standardized effects, you should put a number here. Number of pixels. Great. Good conclusion.
Karen, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Does the contrast of something change depending on how big it is? Like the requirement?
Oh, that's a good question. Here. This is something I did not cover before. And actually before I cover that, I want to bring up a point that luminance operates independently of hue. So even though you might be like, oh, these are very different colors, I can read that well. It still fails this requirement because their lightness is very similar, or like their luminance. I don't really know if lightness is the same as luminance, but their kind of brightness is too similar. Here's an example. If you take all the quote unquote color out of it, you can see how this can be hard for people with color blindness to read. So that's why it doesn't pass that standard. and going back to Matt's question, you can see that it actually passes for larger text and smaller text. And I'm not super confident to explain why that is, but I'm assuming it's something like they're actually literally bigger shapes, so you can probably tell better.
Yeah, because it's like, so how a lot of the biggest issue with contrast is like edge blurring. So if you're colorblind, distinguishing the edges of the shapes is like how you read, right? So if the thing is really, really big, even if you get a little bit of blur, it's still pretty obvious that the thing's like an O or an A or a 3. And actually you'll find that if you make really small text, it's really important to make the contrast high. Because then even for like people who aren't colorblind, it's kind of hard to see. And so you get a little bit more leniency with things like logos and large text and display fonts. And that's why, for example, people often will put large text over a video because the background keeps on changing, but because it's so big, it's not really a problem. So just something to think about. If you want to do like a big animation, that's okay if the contrast is not as good, but smaller text is really important.
That is a very good point, Matt. I would warn that even if it's large, if the contrast is just like inherently not very good, even over like a video, if the video is pretty dark and you're using black text, obviously that's to be avoided. But it is a very good point about sometimes these rules aren't like so hard and fast, like, oh, it fails, I can't use it ever, you know? Yeah, and so color contrast also applies to things like icons, logos, things that people do rely on to navigate a website and to make navigation easier. So that's that for color contrast. Let me check if there's any questions in the chat. No, sounds good. All right. So let me go to my conclusion for any final words. Leo, did you want to say something? I don't know why, but your video popped up.
Yeah, I was just, I went like, I just had a little bit of motion and I guess Zoom picked it up. Anyways, I just wanted to say, geez, you know, it's kind of handy being able to take out all of the lightness or the extra color out of something in order to see what it'd be like if I were colorblind, right? Are there any handy tools for my browser that I could maybe use to do that?
Wow, a tool. What could that feel like? So
oh my gosh.
This is in the list of the great checklists that we went over earlier. But yeah, it's probably good to just have an example of what this looks like. So you can, this is kind of annoying to use. Actually, maybe not. I think you can actually post a URL in here to check it out. Let me go to the actual website. It's actually linked over here. So let me paste the URL. Please let me do it. Darn it. You have to open a file or like open a screenshot. But anyway, take a screenshot and like simulates what things look like. So
a bit of relevance, there are also these ML algorithms that produce images that are reverse filtered. So they'll take like really famous paintings and stuff and then apply a bunch of filters. And it turns out that that technology behind that is what Maya's team is working on.
wow.
So it's like Illuminati connected together. Just think about it.
Such amazing people on this call. Amazing, wonderful. But yeah, so like I guess the gray example was kind of oversimplifying, and I should clarify that. But so this is a good simulator for like what it would actually look like for people with different types of colorblindness, stuff like that. So some concluding notes. I don't really think I have much. I think the main thing to really emphasize is that you really should be asking yourself questions. How can I make this better? How can some people not super enjoy this website? Even if they're not like me, or like even if it's obvious to me what this says, you know, maybe it isn't as obvious to someone else. So that's the only thing I want to leave off with.